When you'll be learning Mandarin, you're going to be coming across these two terms extremely commonly, being active immersion when you are more focused, active, engaged on a piece of content, and with passive immersion where you are more less focused and your mind is wandering elsewhere, or probably you aren't even focused at all. But if you ever are going to interact with an input-based community, then you're going to probably see these terms flying around everywhere. So I'm going to give a small guide and a more in-depth guide compared to the previous video on the full language learning guide about these types of immersions. I'll also be going over many activities and scale them within more active or passive ranges, as well as also give some guidelines on how to use them and how much you should use them. So my name is Farrell. I have learned Mandarin to around HSK4 to HSK5 level through what's called self-immersion. And self-immersion is pretty much where you're at home and you try to listen and read to lots of authentic content instead of doing things like studying and going to classrooms as your main focus. So let's begin. In this video, I'm going to use more of a broader term where it's more how focused you are and how unfocused you are on a piece of content. I'll also be explaining on these pieces of content and pieces of activities, how much they actually give you and how much you can do them per day. So the first thing I want to talk about is background immersion. Background immersion is a type of immersion where what you would do, to be frank, is you would just turn on, let's say, a speaker, or probably put on some earbuds as well, or probably even just your computer, and you would just have that playing, let's say, 24/7. Also includes when you're sleeping as well, and even when you're doing other tasks. Sometimes you don't even turn it off. You could probably turn it off if you want, but this type of immersion is sort of like you just leave it there and let it play all the day. So even though it is something that I do not recommend any of you try doing, it still does have some upsides, and it would be such as it's very, very convenient. You can just pretty much turn it on, forget about it. It's very easy to start tuning in and turn it into something where it's like passive immersion or light task stuff. And it's just pretty much, it's just very, very flexible as well. You can pretty much do it anywhere. If you pretty much get something like a MP3 player, let's see if I have one here. I don't have one here, but there's going to be pretty much something like you can have like an MP3 player, and then you can pretty much like clip it here and then put on earbuds and have it play all the day. And then when there's something to do, you just pause it. However, some downsides to this is that it can also really affect your focus if you're not careful with just like turning it off and such when you're not busy. Also, there's also comes the fact that you might damage your hearing if you just keep listening to something with earbuds all day. Also, this isn't also something that you can do if you, let's say, have a family at home, because they probably don't want to be listening to Chinese 24/7 every single day, having speakers blast in your room. And even if you just have a speaker in your room, it's going to probably limit it to just that room as well. But generally speaking, background immersion can be really easy, but it's also something that is very ineffective. You're also not usually caring about which content you put. You may put stuff like, for example, stuff you've watched before, and you're just not really caring about it, or you're not even listening about it. And also, we do not have to mention about how your sleep can be affected, how your focus can be affected. That's something that's just a given. But honestly, it's something that I would not recommend doing, and it pretty much goes all the way to the passive section where you're pretty much not even paying attention to a lot of what's being said, and even you may be doing it while you're studying or, let's say, doing it. It honestly is kind of like music as well. Also, speaking of which, there are some common activities associated with this, which I would say stuff like, besides just speaking, would be stuff like listening to music, because a lot of the times music can just turn into this white noise. This even happens in your native language, where if you listen to music for extended periods of times, it's just going to sound like you're just more like into the beat. Same thing with your target language as well. It's a great way for motivation, but it's not really great for studying. Also, things like video games, if you're more into the gaming part of it, where there may be just like voice lines screaming, like say, oh, do this, do that, blah, blah, attack, this and that. And even though there are these voice lines that are technically input, they're honestly just more not just background immersion, because you're way more focused on the gameplay and you're not even like engaging with the story at all. So next activity we're going to go with is low task passive immersion. aka it's like you're just doing a task. Let's say you're walking right here and then you're just listening to something. I would far prefer this method to background immersion, and the key differences with background immersion and passive immersion is that passive immersion, you're still putting a little bit of intention in my eyes, where you try to listen to something or you're actually paying attention to something while you're doing something like of a task. You're not going to be trying to fill in every single spot of your day with just background immersion, but instead you're just going to find more like some gaps in your time where you know that you're not really going to be doing anything, and then just might as well, okay, I'm walking right now, I'm doing the dishes right now, or I'm going to, let's say, not shower, but yeah, shower would just be background immersion. But let's say I'm just going to be doing something lightly that's not too loud, won't probably disturb me, and just like relaxing, then yeah, I could just pop something in, like, I don't know, like do coloring pages or something, like for kids. Do you guys even do that anyways? And that's pretty much what it is. Some other common activities I'd say associate with it would be more like probably even talking to friends while, let's say, doing a task, for example. That would be considered more passive immersion, because you're more not really studying something, or even at the level of like just being extremely engaged. You may have like someone talk to you and you're just like, yeah, type, yeah, okay, yeah. So some big pros of this is that it pretty much keeps a lot of the convenience of background immersion, but it's only a little bit less convenient because you have to more or not like get the podcast service, for example, click it and then start watching it. This of course can be circumvented, for example, if you let's say a background immersion playlist, if you ever have one, and then all you do is just pause that, and then when you know it's time to like do something a bit less intensive, then you put it on and then you click play, and then you just walk around with it, and then you just do your task with it. It still keeps that convenience, but you're also still not extremely detached from it. So I think it's a really good balance between just an active and also with just the background immersion types, where you're still sort of focused, you're still gaining some stuff, you're still sort of learning a little bit, but it's not to the point where you just need to fill up all of your day with it. But there are still some cons with it, being that yes, there will be lots of times where passive immersion, for example, is very dependent on how much active immersion you do. Sorry to say this, but you could also do things like, for example, make condensed audio with, let's say, a TV show you watched before, or replay something that you've watched before or listened before or read before in, let's say, your native or target language, and play like that to help you get more comprehensibility. But generally speaking, you're going to gain more from passive immersion with light tasks if you do more active immersion, which is probably one of its biggest downsides, because it is not something that's feasible for beginners. For example, when learning Spanish and trying to listen to a beginner podcast, it was still extremely difficult to listen to, and often more than not, if let's say a person's voice wasn't really nice or pleasant to hear, or if it wasn't something that I've watched before and I really didn't understand, then I would just pretty much doze off immediately. It would immediately just turn to background immersion. My brain would like fill with thoughts and stuff. Speaking of which, you could also be affected by factors. For example, let's just say loud noises as well can probably throw off your focus, or generally just speaking, your thoughts can do it. Overall, it is still a great option to do. You should still do it in many parts of the day, but just be wary that it could turn into background immersion. And I would also not count this as actually something that you count towards your active immersion time. aka if you already have installed a tracker, which you should do right now, then you shouldn't be counting all the passive immersion times you do, even though it could be, let's say, over, let's say, 4 hours a day. If you manage to like manage your time correctly, you could probably get up to like 4 hours of passive immersion, but I would not count that as actual study or active immersion time. Meanwhile, I would consider Freeflow immersion, actual immersion time that you could put in your tracker or something. Freeflow immersion is pretty much the face of self-immersion, which pretty much means when you hear immersion, self-immersion, or even just being like, oh, I learned through comprehensible input, or I learned through watching TV shows and movies, you're most likely thinking about this type, aka you're literally just sitting down, you just relax, you really don't care, you just like consume in the language. Unlike the other one, which is passive immersion, it's actually, I'd say, more of a borderline activity, where it actually sort of borders the ranges of active immersion and passive immersion, mostly because this also can just like passive immersion with light tasks can also fluctuate as well. both can fluctuate because, for example, if you may be a little bit more tired, you may be a bit more passive, and you may just be like listening. However, if you're more active and actually interested, it may shift towards the active part, and you're like actually interested, trying to like kind of decode a little bit in your brain or something. But generally, it's not also as strong as such as the other types we'll be going into, but still quite well. Pros with this is that it's extremely easy to do, just like passive immersion. A little bit more friction, but it's not as much because it's more like something that you're enjoying, something you're trying to enjoy to do. However, there are some downsides, such as, for example, it can be still quite discouraging, and also you aren't really looking anything up, aka you're not really studying anything, or you're trying to like grab new vocabulary that you're looking for. This is pretty much strictly you just sit down and watch something, which also can be still quite good for you, especially in the pros, because it is actually the type of input that we need in order to actually internalize stuff, build a good foundation, in order to actually go and do the harder language tasks throughout the day. Pretty much it's just an overall great filler for hours, also very enjoyable as well, but you're also actively participating in the piece of content. So yes, also some common activities associated with this, just besides, watching TV shows, could be, let's say, reading books that are at your level. You could also be doing, let's say, cross-psych, aka you're speaking and also speaking your native language, and that person is speaking in your target language. You could also actually just be having a normal conversation, is what I would consider free flow, where you're just speaking, but you're not really trying to like improve or prove yourself or dumb down your speech for the other person. You're just talking. That's what I would also consider free flow. Other than that, then let's go to the next level, which would be interactive free flow, which is also very similar to full free flow, except for the fact that now you're starting to look up words occasionally, and maybe perhaps doing the occasional Anki ad card thing. With this, it's pretty much now we've upgraded our free flow in order to do more interactive, because with interactive, unlike full free flow, it usually will not shift back to passive immersion because you're now way more active. You're usually, sometimes I hope that you're actually more engaged in the content, and also as well, you are now always in the active side because you're now trying to look for words that you don't know. You're actually focused on something. You're not just like, oh, I'm just gonna like watch for fun, which, don't get me wrong, is actually a really great thing, but now you're putting a little bit more intention to this. This is probably perhaps one of the best parts about free flow, and pretty much the best activities you could do really frequently, which is for free flow and this interactive immersion. Pretty much you just occasionally look up words. You're not also really stressed about studying and such. You're still mostly relaxing, but you're pretty much now guaranteed to have focus in some aspect or another. And although some cons with this is that you're now also looking up words, aka you may be disrupting yourself too much, especially if you start looking up words way too frequently. You also may get also sort of this paranoia where it's like, I need to be looking up words constantly. I need to be looking up words constantly. But usually I haven't found that has happened to me too many times. But when it does, it's best that you probably calm yourself down and try to shift back a little to that full free flow side, not being too obsessed with looking up words. Also, this goes into tolerating ambiguity, where you shouldn't be looking up every single word that you find. And if you do look up every single word you find, this probably may shift them more towards intensive, which is the way other side of focus, aka like you're super focused. And now some common activities associated with interactive immersion, and it's honestly mostly very similar to the ones listed with full free flow, except that I'll put a bit more, let's say, emphasis on reading, where because reading is more like you gotta like look things up, but also interactive can also fall into the realm of what is called intensive listening or interactive listening, something made up by Refold, I forgot its full name, where you pretty much try to practice your listening by listening to something and then seeing the subtitles. That is something where I would consider more in the realms of interactive and maybe even intensive in some cases. But other than that, let's go move on to the next point, which is study. And what's the difference between study and intensive? Well, what I consider study is not really intensive, because studying, even though, yes, you are going to put a lot more intense focus into it, I would consider more that study that we should do as self-immersion learners would be mostly aimed to actually try to consume more content and understand it rather than being focused on trying to actually understand something at the moment. For example, let's say you're doing Anki, or let's say reviewing a textbook and its text that you're really already familiar with. That is something what I would call study, and it's already in the realm of like you're very active. It's not where it's not interactive, but it's also not intensive level. Some pros to this is that yes, it's something that you can do like pretty easily. If you got like Anki on your phone, you could swipe, you could do it. It's pretty much like a Duolingo level. Unlike the other, let's say, active immersion subtypes, this is actually quite easy to do because it sometimes can be strangely relaxing when you just like score something well on, let's say, Duolingo or language app or Anki. The only thing I would say is that it could be done a bit more overboard, where you could overdo it if you're not careful with it, since if you overstudy something and you're pretty much studying more than you actually are consuming content, aka the thing we actually need in order to, acquire things, or even things like speaking, then that's going to run into a problem. But now let's go move on to the start of the show, and the most active thing, aka intensive immersion. aka pretty much you're putting your full attention, but this time it's on a piece of content and you're really trying to decode it. You're really trying to like understand it. You're really actually chugging a lot of mental energy, unlike study where it's more review and you're just like being a bit more relaxed with the sort of study. Intensive is a lot more study based, where for example in this clip right here, I pretty much get a text and just try, for example, like putting it into ChatGPT. If you do, then make sure to check. But for the sake of this is just an example where you like show where all like the bits of text are like translated word for word. Try studying it, and even for example, getting this text, putting it into text to speech, and then trying to like do this text to speech thing where you just listen to it and also read the passage at the same time in order to get full understanding. Once you get that full understanding, you go back to the original text and try to read it with full comprehension. It also is more associated with things, for example, you're actually like, doing dictionary lookups a lot. You're making probably lots of Anki cards, doing sentence mining manually if you don't do that automatically with something like Magaku. And pretty much you're also doing something like, for example, shadowing, where you're like putting your full attention on a piece of thing. You're trying to really replicate something. You're probably with a tutor and you're trying to like fix your speech. You're trying to like boost your comprehension. And all of these pretty much really intensive tasks that are pretty much more the face of studying a language sort of thing, where you're actually like putting a lot of deliberate effort, which is pretty nice. Which the pros is that yes, this will get you a lot of reap benefits. It's pretty much very, very efficient for the time. But the cons is that I see sometimes a lot of people, including me before, that they try to do this every single part of the day and treat it like their new free flow immersion or interactive free flow immersion. And as a result, if they like keep doing this and keep trying to keeping up with this, where they just keep trying to like study so deliberately every single part of the day, they're pretty much going to crash and burn extremely hard because of this. So it's also something that you have to also be really careful about. And that's all I pretty much have to say about all the types of immersions, giving them some explanations, some common activities to associate them. So let me give you now some general guidelines on how to actually use them. For the passive immersion side, such as background and passive immersion, I would say actually to do as much as you can. Background immersion, don't stress about trying to like fill up all day, but pretty much do as much as you can as long as you're comfortable with it, where it's like, oh, I can walk, I can run, I can listen to something while doing something. That is an extremely effective way to like fill up your day. Of course, like I said again and again, do not overdo it. Do not do it while you're doing, let's say, an intensive task. Like for example, I'm right now recording a video right now. If let's say I right now had here like some sort of TV show playing, it's probably going to mess up my focus and disrupt, let's say, the whole video as well. And another thing is that with full free flow and interactive free flow, I'd say a good amount wouldn't actually be your entire day, because we're not going to try to be those people that just sit down in their, let's say, computer chair and then try to, let's say, watch anime the entire day. But I'd say around 3 to 4 hours max would be good. If you're not someone that's super busy, you could probably tone this down to around 1 to 2 hours if you're more busy. However, just keep in mind that you may not make as much progress as I'd listed before in the video where I talked about why 1 hour of immersion in Mandarin isn't sufficient, and it's best that you try to fill more parts of your day if you can with stuff like passive immersion, and pair it with, of course, intensive and studying, which I would more put into max 1 to 2 hours a day a bit more strictly, because this is something we're actually going to put a lot more attention into. It's going to be a lot more fatiguing to do, and once you're done with that, then it's pretty much you're done. You pretty much just go have fun in the language, pretty much build that base in order to have a bit more passive consumption in the language. But even though this passive consumption isn't as bad, it's also not going to be as good as, let's say, the active immersion, where this really active things that you're going to be doing, like intensive focus, is the part where you're actually going to be like deliberately practicing and trying to get to the advanced levels or break out of, let's say, a plateau with. So that's all I gotta say. I also have a Mandarin reading program, link in the description if you're interested. And now we have a road to explore. 我们的旅程刚开始. Thank you for watching.